CSIS 1430 is filmed before a live studio audience.
All right, what I got here is a project where I've already built the style sheet. I'll let you look at that in just a second. And then I'm going to just show you some of the actual styles or classes that I've made in here, right? So let's just start off with a paragraph. And I have a class called text-color, not color, dash primary. This is I chose this name for the primary color of my whole website, right? It's this sort of like bluish color. So the primary color I'll be using for my site is called text primary. And we'll just say hello. And if we refresh it, we get this. There you go. That's the primary color. So anywhere I want to have like the main color, I'm going to use that class, right? And then I have a few other ones, like I have a secondary color. So a secondary, and it's this sort of grayish color. And then I also have one for warnings. That's always a fun one. And one for danger. And one for information, info. These are all classes in my style sheet. And you can see they're all different colors, right? Okay. Also, I've done it to where I have those same colors as backgrounds. So I can make a background of that paragraph, whatever color. So BG dash, we'll go with info. Right? So you won't be able to see the text on this bottom one here, but you'll see that they now all have a background of that lightish blue color, right? And I also made one called primary. We'll put that here, right? So you can see the primary color there, right? This is a very common way to program. You make classes that you don't want to have a class called blue, right? And then it changes the text blue. One of the big reasons for that, number one, is that you want to make sure that your class names are not too descriptive of what they're doing, but rather they describe the content of the HTML, right? So what kind of content is blue, right? What is that? But primary, well, this is primary content. This is secondary content. This is content that's warning you about something, right? So there's a whole bunch of other ones. I'm going to show you a bunch of these different classes that I've written here. But one thing that I've also made is a div, a class that I can put in a div or wherever I want, called container. And what this does, we've done this a bunch of times before where we use like wrap or something like that and it wraps around the content. So I just decided to call it container instead. Right, and so just does that. It just gives a little bit of padding on the sides there, okay? So let's take a look at my style sheet here that I made. Right here, CSS style sheet. It's pretty big. It's 10,000 lines long. And I didn't make it. Bootstrap did. This is the Bootstrap style sheet, okay? So my little stunt there, if you will, was just to trick you a little bit to prove a point. And the point is Bootstrap is just a style sheet. That's it. It's just a style sheet that somebody else wrote. Who wrote it? Line 5 right there, Twitter. Okay, Twitter created this years ago. That's it. It's just a style sheet. So I want to make sure that sinks in. That style sheet, if you have that style sheet in your document, then you can use all those classes I just used, plus all these other 10,000 lines worth of other ones. So the catch is you got to learn all the freaking classes, right? Well, Bootstrap has huge documentation on how to use all this stuff. And we're going to spend a lot of time looking at that today. Did I sufficiently grab your attention? My little trick. Who believed me? Anybody? Did all of you believe me? Yeah. Yes, that's the goal. To trick you all. Okay, so we're going to dive into the documentation. We're going to look at all the different ideas and a whole bunch of different classes that Bootstrap has. But first, let's see, how do we even get it? How do we get the style sheet? How do I download it or whatever, right? So if we go to this link right here, which I'll put into the lecture notes, if we go here, and you can see Right here it lists all the versions, all the way from the very first version, version 1, all the way up to version 4.5. Okay? Next year, hopefully, version 5 will be ready. Version 5 is currently in alpha testing right now. The hope is it'll be done by early next year for a couple reasons. Number one, it's going to be better than everything. I've already seen what they're doing with it and what they're changing. Number two, I've got a huge project that I'm holding off on until they're done because I want to use Bootstrap 5. Okay? But remember, it's just a style sheet. So they saved me 10,000 lines of code, right? I don't have to write a style sheet. I can just use theirs. Okay? And I can override stuff with my own style sheet. We'll talk about that in a minute. One of the big things they're doing with Bootstrap 5, which won't mean a whole lot to you right now since you don't know a lot about what Bootstrap is just yet, but they're removing all jQuery support. Okay? jQuery is a huge library that, in my opinion, is just bloatware. I hate it. It's ugly, it's messy, it's humongous, and Bootstrap relies on that. Well, they're removing that dependency in Bootstrap 5. That's one of the hugest things they're doing. There's a couple other things that are pretty big but minor compared to that. That's one of the biggest reasons I'm interested. I hated Bootstrap until recently, right? They've made some big improvements. Okay, so we're on version 4.5. So if you just go to getbootstrap.com, you're going to end up where you can download it, right? And I'm going to click on 4.5 right here. And this is where you can download it. Now, you can download the file like I did. And I just renamed it to style.css just to mess with you guys, right? Normally when you download it, it would be called bootstrap.css. But it's just a style sheet. Call it whatever you want, right? Also, you can just hot link. You know how we've done that where we hot link to a Google font, right? You can do the same thing with Bootstrap. And just right here, if you just go to getbootstrap.com, so I'm going to start there, getbootstrap.com, and you can go to Get Started, which takes you to the documentation, or to Download, which takes you to this page right here, where you can download it, or you can just hot link. So here's where you can download. We'll look at doing that another day. But what we want to do is just copy it, right? And so I think I just passed it. And so we want this one right here. Now, notice a minute ago, the page I was on didn't have this JavaScript business. For now, we're not even going to use that. We don't need it for the stuff we're going to be looking at today. But when you copy that, it's going to grab the JavaScript and the CSS right there. So I just copied it. Just going to come back over here and paste it right here. And so see that it's got this JavaScript business. Don't worry about that. We're not going to use that right now. We're just going to use their style sheet. Okay? The other way to get there is if you go to that other page I was on, which is getbootstrap.com/docs/versions. I prefer going this way because I can click on the version I want, which is the current one, 4.5. And then you'll notice here it takes me right to just the CSS. See that? So click that. And that's the link I'm going to put in the lecture notes. So we're going to use that, which should be the same thing that I've already got there. Okay? And just to prove that that is working, I'm no longer linking to that style.css, and I'll go in here in my project and I will remove it to my desktop. I'm going to leave it on the desktop so we can look at it from time to time, but there's no CSS in this project here. Yet, when I refresh it, still works just fine because I'm hot linked to the live version of the style sheet, right? Now, the pros and cons of that. If they change the style sheet, my code breaks, right? Now, they're not going to make a drastic change, and typically what they do, if they change the style sheet, they give it a new version number. I'm using a specific version, so they won't change that one. They'll make a new one, and if I want to use a new version, I just switch out my hot link. Okay? Okay, questions on that basic idea there? We good? Bootstrap, what it is, we're good? Okay, all right. Let's look at some things you could do with it. And again, I'm going to have this on the desktop here. I'm going to rename it back to Bootstrap. I'm going to have it here on the desktop so we can refer to it, so we can just see some of the stuff that's in it. Okay? Like here's a bunch of a bunch of variables that we have here. We've done this before. Here's how HTML is applied, the style that's just the default for that, the default for the body, and there's a whole bunch of classes as we scroll down past this orange text. Eventually we'll see, like there's some classes here, okay? We're going to be looking at some of these today. Okay, let's start here. Notice that there is no padding on this business here. Well, you would normally make a class that's called paragraphs or main paragraph or something like that. And then in there you'd say padding equals whatever, right? Well, they've already got a class that does that specifically. It's just called P. Just put P on there and bam, you got padding. Okay? Now it's a little, there's one more step, but it's P dash and then some number. Okay? The numbers go from 0 to 5. And the numbers represent how much padding there is. Now it's not, one isn't 1 pixel or 1 inch or 1 anything. In the documentations, which we'll look at in a minute, it tells you exactly what is 1. It's all percentage based and based on rems and all kinds of stuff, right? But the simple version is this. If we just do P-1, there's a class called P-1 that gives us that much padding, right? There's a class in the style sheet called P-2 that gives us that much padding. And there's one called P-3, gives us that much padding, and so on all the way up to 5. Okay? Margin works the exact same way. So we can do margin dash 0, and that'll remove the margins completely. Now they're all squished together. Or we can make it margin 1, and there we have a little bit of margin. Okay? So how would we find this in the documentation? Let's head over here, and at the top right here, where it says 4.5, that's the documentation we're looking at. We're looking at the documentation for version 4.5. I could, if I want to look at the documentation for 3.41, because maybe that's the one you're using. Maybe you have an older project that's using an older version. Just make sure that whatever one you're using, you're looking at that documentation, okay? So we're on the current one, the correct one. And then over here on the left, there's a bunch of these bold things. You have the getting started, you have layout, content, components, utilities, and so forth. Getting started, we've kind of looked at it already, like downloading it. It's talking a little bit about JavaScript, some browsers and device support. There's just some sort of information about Bootstrap. But then we want to look at layout, content, components, and utilities. Those are the 4 main areas we're going to be in. Okay? So right now we're talking about padding. That's under utilities right here, and you see I expanded utilities and now has a whole list of stuff right here. See that? Okay? We're going to go to spacing. Spacing is padding and margin. That's a term you should be familiar with. In my comments on your homework assignments, I'll often talk about spacing, and then parentheses I'll say margin and padding, right? But here it tells you right here, here's the documentation for using the M and the P, and there's other things I don't want you to see yet, right? I don't want to confuse you. We'll get to it later today, but this is where the documentation is, right? And it's just a whole page of stuff here that explains how it works. Okay? So we'll be bouncing back and forth between what's in my brain, right, and what's on the documentation, okay? All right, so we put a little bit of padding on there. We put some margin on there. We can do a whole bunch of other things, though. And we can override it if we want, like I mentioned. We'll talk about that in a little bit, okay? Okay, so let's look in here. We'll make some notes here on the side. And first of all, we looked at this idea of there's some colors that are just part of the Bootstrap library, right? And so we had primary, and we had secondary, and we had info, and a whole bunch of other ones. I'm not going to list them all out. But you'll notice here, I use text-primary, okay? Well, you can also do it as a background. So I used BG-primary or -info. Right, info is a color. If I'm using it on a button, BTN-primary, whatever, right? If I'm using it for a border, border whatever color. Okay, and we'll see some of that in a little bit. All right, so we have the colors here, and then there are sizes, and there are 3 that we'll see here, and I'll explain what this means in a minute. And then there are breakpoints, which we'll get to also later today, that are similarly labeled with extra small, small, medium, large, and extra large, right? So what these are, small, medium, and large, these are sizes, so I can have, for example, a small button, a medium button, and a large button, okay? Breakpoints, however, are dealing with screens. Extra small screens, medium screens, large screens, and extra large screens. What does all of it mean? We'll get there. But I just want to throw those out for a minute, okay? Okay, so here's an example of how this is useful. Let's make a button here, at the very top. And this is just HTML. We already know how to do this. And I'm going to, just for the moment, turn off my CSS. So there's no Bootstrap, nothing. No CSS. And you'll see this is the default behavior that a browser puts on a button, right? It looks like a button, okay? Clicky, clicky. If I turn on Bootstrap, or my style sheet, which is just Bootstrap, this is the default behavior, which is arguably more hideouser than the other one, right? But that's just what it does to buttons. So in other words, if I looked in the style sheet, which is right here, and I search for button, find it, and here we go. This is what it's doing just to the button. It's not, in fact, that's putting a class on it. Let's find just button. So we have button.close. We want just plain old button here with nothing extra. It's a lot of them, it looks like. There we go, see? So right here, just the button. It's giving a border radius of nothing, and when you're focusing on it, it puts a little outline around it, and then there's some other things here. It's the overflow is visible, it has no text transformation, and a whole bunch of other stuff right here that's being applied to it, right? That's just default behavior of the button, okay? Well, there's a class that we can apply to it that gives it a little bit more styling. Class equals btn. So now we have this, and if I click on it, it has this little background effect here, okay? Still not the best looking thing, but you can see that a little bit of style has been applied to it. Well, as I mentioned a minute ago, if I want it to be a certain color, it's btn dash whatever the color is. So we'll go with warning. So now I have this color here, nice looking button, okay? And I can put next to that btn primary, btn info, and I'm not going to do all of them, but we can do just a few so you can see. There we go. Nice, colorful. Those are good looking buttons, okay? Better than I would have come up with on my own, right? That's one of the advantages of Bootstrap, okay? Well, as I mentioned, we can do this small, medium, large keyword. All that is, it's just going to be part of a class name, okay? So I can have a btn-small. That's just another class. So this first button here has got 3 classes applied to it, right? The btn class, the btn small class, and the btn warning class, okay? And then I could do btn medium, and I could do btn large, right? So now we get 3 different size buttons, okay? Now there's a little catch here. You have to have, when you do this, you have to have that btn class there, that little just btn by itself. Because if I remove that, things are different, right? Now this is okay, it's more of a blocky kind of feel, and it doesn't look horrible. But if you want it to have that sort of rounded, smooth look, then you need to have that btn class. That's what gives it that piece. The btn small, medium, large gives it the size, and then the btn dash color gives it the color. Warning, primary info, danger, right?
Good question.
So the question is, if we're targeting a paragraph, should we start the class name with P? And the answer is no, actually not, because this class, like for example, line 16, P, that's for padding, right? That's just a class that's called padding, right? This btn, I'm applying it to a button, but I can apply it to anything I want. It's just a class, right? So for example, I could have an anchor, right? I could say href is nothing, and then we'll say class equals btn, btn large, btn danger, and this is a fake button, right? It's just a link. Okay, so when I refresh it, what did I miss there? btn, there we go. When I refresh it, it looks just like a button because I used the button class, right? But it's not a button at all. It's actually just an anchor tag, but it will behave exactly like that class is designed to do, right? So these classes can be applied wherever you want. If you apply it to a button, it might slightly be a little bit different than if you applied it to a paragraph or an anchor tag or a whatever. But remember, it's just a class, right? And you can apply classes to whatever you want, okay? So let's just get rid of these paragraphs here and talk a little bit more about these buttons. And we'll get rid of this anchor tag as well. So now we just have these buttons here, and in fact, we'll get rid of, well, we'll keep the danger one. So this bottom one here, the red one, button danger. We've done this in the past where we have our own class that's called active, right? And then that's whatever page you're on, we put active on that tab so that it sort of stands out a little bit differently. Well, Bootstrap does the same thing. They have a class called active, right? And if I refresh, this is a regular red button and this is an active button, right? Notice there's no hover effect when I go over it like there is over here. Notice when I hover on the thing on the left, it matches this thing on the right. So the hover and the active are the same, okay? So you can apply active to wherever you want. Also, this is just a plain HTML thing that I'm about to do. You can deactivate or disable a button. Notice where I'm putting it, disabled, right? That disables the button. So let's turn off the style sheet again. And you can see this is the default behavior when you put disabled. It's not a class, it's inside right here, it's in the tag. It's just a keyword that goes in the tag, right? And so it disables the button. You can't click on it, your thing doesn't turn into a finger pointer or anything like that. We put the style back on. You see this little pink one here. It's the equivalent of being grayed out. It's like pinked out or whatever, right? Okay, you can't click on it, it doesn't turn into a finger. So there's a whole bunch of things you can do with buttons. We come over to the documentation here, go to the components, right? The button is a component, and you go down to buttons. And here's all these, there's some other colors here I didn't show you that are available. And it tells you all the different things you can do. It shows you examples here. For example, this one, button outline, okay? So what we could do here is we'll take this bottom one, now we'll take this one here. Instead of calling it BTN danger, if we look here, it tells us BTN outline dash whatever color, right? So I can say BTN outline danger. And now when I refresh, it's an outline style button, right? And you can do that with all the colors as well. Okay, so look in the documentation. We have the large button here, which we looked at, and we have the small button, okay? You can also do block level, right? So let's make another button down here, and we'll just say BTN block. Refresh. And I should put a color on that, BTN info. And now it's just block level, it takes up the whole width, right? That could be useful if you have maybe a login screen where it's just a small square in the middle of the screen. You want that to fill up. And all of you, I think, have tried styling a form, a CSS form, or sorry, an HTML form. And it's messy and it's a pain. Bootstrap did all the work for you, right? Just use their classes, okay? So we have our buttons that we looked at for a second here, and we're gonna look at some typography. By the way, if you guys ever watch YouTube videos or tutorials about this kind of stuff, one of my favorite YouTube tutorial guys, his name is Colt Steele, and his videos are awesome. And I actually have one of his Udemy courses on Bootstrap. And the structure and the way we're walking through Bootstrap today is very similar to what he does in his course. So I want to make sure that he's getting credit for the way this is structured. I really like the way he teaches it. It's better than almost anybody I've ever seen teach Bootstrap before. He has a good thought process on how to bring it all together. So it's definitely inspired by his tutorials. Okay, anyway, that aside, let's take a look here at the typography, and we'll kind of move that to the top so we can make some notes. In the typography, that's just dealing with font sizes, font spacing, and that kind of thing, right? There's a few classes that are going to be useful to you. For example, there's one called H1. Now that's not a tag, that's a class, okay? And there's H2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? So H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6, just like the tags. What these do If you look at the CSS here, we could probably find one real quick. We'll just do a search for H1. And right here, you can see that H1, the actual heading one, and the class H1 have the exact same font size. So that means I could take an H3 tag and apply H1 class, and it'll look like an H1, even though it's an H3, right? Does that make sense? So let's show you that real quick. Let's clean up some of these buttons here. And we'll do H1, huge, or hug. Hug your HTML. Okay, so refresh that. That's what an H1 is by default, right? No extra classes applied to it. And then here's what an H2 looks like. A little bit smaller, right? We'll call that less huge. That's an H2. Well, let's do, say, an H3 right here. And we'll say less huge. Right, see, they get smaller as we go along, like a typical H1 through 6 would do. But if, let's say, on H3, I decide to give it a class of H1, poof, it's exactly like an H1, but it's an H3. Okay, why would you do that? One of the big reasons is because H1 through 6 has specific meaning to Google search engines. And if you search for a key phrase, for example, and the H1 of a web page has that key phrase, then it's a little bit higher ranking in Google. So if I'm searching for magic tricks and the H1 of the page that it sees has magic tricks in it, that's Google's like, oh, he probably wants a page like this. And so those tags have meaning. Well, you may want to have something like an H3 that's not as meaningful to the search engine, but you still want it to be big. So that's one of the reasons you do that, okay? But there's some other ones here. So the ones that we're going to look at today and use a little bit more, there is display -1, -2, -3, and -4, okay? So if I apply that right here on H1, for example, class equals display 1. Ginormous, okay? So let's clean these up here, get rid of those. There's also another one that's called, it's called lead, okay? This is a pretty common one. You'll use this to be maybe the first paragraph of a bunch of paragraphs, right? So if we just go here to Metallica and we'll do 3 paragraphs, copy, and we'll just stick those right here. Okay, we'll get rid of those buttons for now. So normal default behavior right here with Bootstrap, those are what your paragraphs look like, right? It picks a font for you, it picks a color, it picks a style, whatever. But if I apply on the first paragraph here, for example, class lead, and refresh it, slightly different. It's a little bigger, a little bit bigger font, line spacing, and just a little bit more. It draws a little bit of attention to it, right? Okay. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff with typography, right? I'm going to show you the documentation, and we're going to be done with it for now, but I want to show you where you can find it. So if you go down to Utilities, and down here, Typography, not in Utilities. Let's go with Content, maybe. All right, there we go. And so if you go through this is, you know, a pretty good page of documentation here about the different common uses, right? And it always has code too. A whole bunch of code here that you can use as well, okay? And there's some things right here, like some default styling of some tags like the mark tag or the delete tag or the S tag. This is what they'll look like here, okay? So you can look through that if you want. Okay, questions on that? Feeling all right? All right, next up, let's take a look at the Jumbotron, okay? You know what a Jumbotron is? Basketball game, the big screen, right? This is the same basic idea here. It's a big display that you'd stick at the top of your page, okay? So, come over to our code here, and let's clear this out. And right inside of our container, for example, we'll make a div with a class of Jumbotron. And inside of it, we'll have this. And in fact, this display 1 here we'll do something about the Metallica concert that just happened a couple weeks ago. All within my hands. Okay, so now I refresh it. And there you have this little gray banner here, right? Now, of course, you can choose the color. So if we want to change the background color, just right here on the Jumbotron, we can say background info. Refresh it, and it changes the background to that info color, right? We can pick any of those, primary, secondary, warning, danger, any of those we want. But this is something you've actually probably seen in websites before. And so it'll be something like this. Maybe the next thing, the paragraph will be the lead. And it'll be something like, join us. Like my ad copy skills there. There we go. So it's got this little sort of lead paragraph here. The big main message here to get your attention. And then you might see something like a button right underneath that, right? Button. Class equals button, and maybe we'll put the warning, or we'll do the danger. I like warning, it's an orangish color. And we'll make it a large button, BTN large, and we'll say get your ticket now, right? You might see something like this at the top of the page, and that may look a little bit familiar to you, right? Now, there's a couple different ways you can do this. Number one, if you'll notice, there's rounded corners there. You see them? Okay. What's happening right now, this is filling up the container that's outside of it, right? You can remove that completely, right? I don't have to have that container there. And then it just takes up the whole screen, okay? Another common thing that you'll see people do is they'll make the Jumbotron the outside, and then inside the Jumbotron they'll put a container, which has a little bit of padding on the edges, right? Or margin. So inside here, we'll do div class equals container, and then we'll close that out down here. That looks pretty good, right? So this is a common thing that you'll see. And in fact, here is a popular site that uses Bootstrap right here. You ever seen this site before? This uses Bootstrap, okay? It's not, I looked through it a little bit earlier to see if I could find a Jumbotron anywhere, and I couldn't really find one. But this is similar, right? This big, huge image in the front here. And let me make sure this is the full size. And you know this image changes on a pretty regular basis, right? And then there's little sections right here, down here, okay? But this is actually using Bootstrap. And if we go here to this page, this section right here, this is using what's called cards. Okay, it's a Bootstrap classes that a bunch of them that work together that make this kind of an effect where you have a picture, like an H1, and a little rollover effect with some text. Just applying a couple classes magically does all this for you, which we'll learn about another day. Also though, in Bootstrap 5, they're removing the cards system, if you will, and replacing with something different. It'll do the same kind of thing, but it's a little bit different, okay? But this is one of the effects that you can do. There's also the carousel, which you've seen, right, where the images slide across the screen. That's all done with Bootstrap, or it can be done with Bootstrap, okay? This page right here, Stone Cold Professor, I'm using Bootstrap. My navigation menu, when I resize, watch my navigation, turn into a little hamburger menu. That's all just using a couple of Bootstrap classes, okay? And the home page is actually using some Bootstrap 3 stuff right here, okay? This is all just Bootstrap. The individual pages are not, I mean, they uses some of the styling, the fonts and stuff, but for example, this playlist right here, this is just me embedding a video, and I'm using the Bootstrap font colors here, and I might be using the grid on some of this. This In Queens thing, for example, however, this is just not a whole lot of Bootstrap CSS in here because it was a very, very unique custom thing that I was trying to do here, right? I wanted to specifically color these a certain way and everything, okay? Anyway, so Bootstrap's out there. People use it. It's all over the place. I'm using pieces of it here and there. Another thing we can do here is we don't have to stick with the defaults of Bootstrap. You can overwrite them. You can use your own stuff, right? So let's make a style sheet, and we'll just save it as our normal thing that we do, style.css. We'll put it right here in our CSS file. And we'll do something like, we'll make a class called Jumbo Image, and we'll actually give it a background image. We'll say background image is URL image / Metallica, which I believe is already in my folder. Okay, so this right here, if in my HTML, I have one style sheet right here, right? Well, I can just do another style sheet. You can put as many style sheets as you want, and they'll just be run in the order that they show up in the document, right? So here's another one, link href is CSS, style.css. Its relationship is a style sheet, and the type is text CSS. Okay, so now it's going to run the Bootstrap style sheet, and then it's going to run mine. And if by coincidence this class name I created called Jumbo Image is one that Bootstrap also has in their style sheet, well, whatever I say in mine wins, because it's further down the cascade, right? Now, if I moved mine up in the cascade, that wouldn't work, but I have mine below there, so it'll win. Now, it doesn't overwrite everything, it just overwrites this one thing, the background image. If their version of Jumbo Image has a different background image, mine wins, right? Only the pieces I overwrite. But I don't think they actually have one called Jumbo Image, so we're good either way. So now we'll just apply that to our Jumbotron right here. We'll add another class, Jumbo Image, and we'll refresh. So when we refresh, we get this. Now the image is wonky, right? It's taking up, it's like repeating, so we can turn that off. In our CSS, we can just say background size cover. That'll stretch it out like that, which looks pretty cool. But of course our text is all wonky now, right? Well, use the text colors. We can change it if we want, or maybe that's a bad image, right? But I'm sure you've seen something like this, right? An image at the top with maybe a little hover over it. And there's some little tricks you can do where you put sort of a translucent background on the text so you can see it better, all for another time. But this is something that you've probably seen in a real website, okay? Notice up here, it's hard to see, but in the corners you can see the rounded edges. Do you see it? See that? They're rounded down there. To get rid of that, come over here, and we want to have Jumbotron-fluid, and that makes it fluid and takes up the whole page there, or the whole whatever its container is. Gets rid of those little rounded corners, okay? So Jumbotrons, again, come over here to Bootstrap, go to Components, and there's Jumbotron right there, and it tells you all about how to use them, okay? And there's actual code here for doing it, and a whole bunch of other stuff, okay? All right, next up, let's take a look at dealing with borders and shadows, okay? Because that's a pretty cool effect that you can do, and every time I make a shadow, I have to look it up. I do every time. In fact, I'm going to show you one of the ways I do shadows, okay? So let's just clear all this out here, and we'll make a few divs inside of the container, class equals container, and then in there I'll just put a few divs. We'll go give it a class equals like test or something like that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. And over here in my style sheet, I'm going to style those up. So div.test. But the margin, we can remove that because that's something I can do in Bootstrap with a Bootstrap class, right? We just go right here, m-1, right? There we go, margin, poof. Okay, we can't see them yet because I haven't put a border on them, right? So let's put a border on them, and it's just border and the end, poof. There is a border right there. Very, very small, faint border, but it's there, the gray border, see it? So inside the Bootstrap class or CSS file, there is a class called border. And there it is, and look what it does. 1 pixel, solid gray color, and then important just means it wins the battle with any cascading issues, okay? Not a fan of using that keyword, but with Bootstrap where it's trying to make sure it wins most of the battles, you're going to see it a lot, okay? Well, I can also say things like this. Border dash color is primary, right? Now I have that primary blue color, or I could have made warning or whatever. Okay, so normally if I want to put a drop shadow on this, this is an effect I use a lot. I go to csstricks.com and then I click on the search box and I type box shadow. And right here, I think that's the one. Scroll down and I find the one I like, which is always this one right here. And I grab this style right there, right? And then I copy and paste it in my code. This is how I do it every time. I've never bothered to remember that. And it's not that hard if you look at it, right? But when I refresh it, I get that nice little box shadow effect, which is kind of cool in some applications. Okay. Well, with Bootstrap, let's remove that. It's gone again. You can actually just put a shadow by simply saying shadow. There's a class called shadow, and it puts a shadow everywhere. Okay? If you're trying to do that specific shadow, there may or may not be a way to do that. Let's just take a look here. Documentation, we're going down to utilities, shadows, and you can see right here, right? Here's a no shadow, small shadow, regular, large, and you can see shadow none, shadow small. There's those keywords, right? So I can do shadow dash small, shadow dash large, and you can see it's not as pronounced here, right, on the first one, okay? If you want to see more about that, just go to the shadow documentation, okay? So as far as I know, you can't necessarily get that exact effect that I just copied and pasted. So if you want that specific thing, you're gonna have to make it yourself, right? The same way I always do, right? Copy and paste. Okay, so let's get rid of the shadows though. We don't want those, but let's play with the borders here. So one border is primary color, one's the secondary color, one is the warning color, one is the danger color, one is the info color. So now we have a bunch of different colored borders here. And we can do a bunch of different things, right? I can just say border dash top. There's a class called border dash top. What do you suppose it does? Just mix the top border, right? That's it. Okay? And there's dash bottom and so forth, left and right. So you can do that. But you can also do another thing where we say rounded. Whoa, rounded. And that just rounds the corners, right? And again, if you look in the Bootstrap CSS file for rounded, there it is. Now look, there's a rounded small, right? There's a rounded top, a rounded right, which you would also have learned in the documentation, okay? But rounded is just giving it a border radius. Notice it's giving it a border radius of 0.25 rem versus 0.2 rem. So small will be a little bit different. So let's take a look at the small one right here. And we'll say rounded dash small. Now it's subtle, but there is a difference. Okay? Did you see it change? I refreshed it. Look at the difference between that and that rounding. Slightly different. Okay? It's subtle, but it's there. Okay? You can also do rounded circle. You get that. Okay? You can also do rounded pill. Now it's going to look the same because my dimensions are 100 by 100, they're square. But if you make it a rectangle, you'll see the difference. So let's go like width of 500 here. Okay? The difference is circle is really an oval and pill looks like a pill, right? There's all kinds of different things you can do if you just know the classes. Now remember way back when, like the first day of class, we learned about HTML, we learned about tags, attributes, and values, right? And what makes us good HTML programmers? We remember all the tags, or a lot of them, right? There's 70 of them. I don't remember all of them either. Okay, and I just showed you a bunch of new ones you've probably never seen before, the delete tag, the mark tag a minute ago. But we learned most of the tags, we learned the attributes, we learned the values that can go in there. We got the CSS, what did we learn? Well, properties, selectors, and values, right? Or selectors, properties, values. What made us good at it? Remembering all the selectors, remembering all the properties, remembering the values. What makes us good at JavaScript? Remembering what some of the built-in functions are, remembering how to do a loop and a branch, if statements, and so forth, remembering how to do variables, those basic things. What makes us good at Bootstrap? remembering all these freaking classes, right? There's a ton of class names. So many of them that there's a whole website dedicated to teaching you what they are and how to use them, okay? So today's intent is to make sure you just get your head around the idea. Frankly, I haven't really shown you what you can do with it, right? I've shown you here's a couple colors, here's a couple rounded things. Next time we meet, I'm going to show you what you can do with it, right? We still got a couple more things to look at today, but the next time we meet, I'm going to show you some really cool things you can do with forms, navigation, and the grid, the almighty grid, okay? But let's look at a couple more things here. The big one is I want to show you about how this breakpoint business works, okay? It has built-in media queries that are just part of the Bootstrap class, or the Bootstrap CSS, okay? So if you go here, search for breakpoints, in the search up there, take you right here, and you'll recall I had this little note here of these 5 breakpoints. What they are is this. Starting at 0 up through 576 is what we call an extra small device, okay? If it's above 576 but less than 768, we call that a small device. If it's between 768 and 992, we have medium. Between 992 and 12 is large, and then above 12 is extra large. Okay? So in my classes, a whole bunch of the class names have a variation of the class name with a dash SM or a dash XL, which means only use this style on an extra large screen or on a small screen, bless you, or on a medium screen or whatever, right? So let's look at an example of that. Let's go back to this where we were dealing with some padding stuff here. So we'll go back to some paragraphs, okay? Paragraph, and we'll say, actually we'll do a button. Class equals BTN, BTN primary, and we'll put a padding level 1 on it, okay? Click. So first of all, what's that button gonna look like? See if you remember. Yeah, it's that darker blue, right? And it's gonna have a little bit of padding on it, right? Okay, so we'll refresh it, and there's our fabulous button right there, okay? So let's start it here with padding of 0. That's 0 padding, right? What I want to do as the page grows, increase the padding, okay? So let me show you first the difference between the padding on all these. I think we did this already, but just in case, okay? That's the difference in padding. So we don't want to have 5 buttons. I just want to have the button have more padding as the screen gets bigger, okay? So this is really cool what you can do here. Here we go. What this means right now, let me get to the smallest I can get here. Okay, that's a small screen with 100% zoomed, perfect, not zoomed in or zoomed out size, okay? So this P-0 actually means I want you to use P as the padding class, 0 padding for everything that's extra small screen and bigger. Well, that's all screens, right? So if I make this a bigger size, it's still 0 padding, okay? But I can also add a class in here that says, for small screens, use level 1, P-SM-1. This one right here is essentially me saying that, okay? But there is no such thing. XS is the default, so you don't actually have to put that in there. In fact, you can't put it in there, it won't work. So P0 means give me 0 for extra small and bigger until I get to small, then make it 1. So if I refresh and I drag this out as it gets to the size of small, which was 576 or whatever, you see it changes to hair, okay? I can also say, oh, and by the way, when you get to medium, apply level 2, right? Refresh it, and now if as I drag it, when I get to medium, which I think was 768, poof, changed a little bit more. See it? And then keep doing that, right? I'll just say when I get to large, do 5. That's the biggest one. All right, so if I stretch it out and I hit large, I think I refreshed it. Poof, right? So what's going on here? Imagine there's this invisible XS right there. This is saying there's just a class. This one doesn't exist, but we're going to pretend for a moment that it does. There's just a class that's called PXXXS0, which means put padding level 0 on extra small screens and larger, right? But that part's just sort of implied. But this class really does exist, PSM1. That's saying, well, for screens this big, small, which is, we looked at the range a minute ago, apply padding level 1. For medium screens and up, padding level 2, right? There's lots of different things out there where you can just tack on this little MD or SM, and it'll only show it based on that screen size, okay? It's different than show me a small button. That SM means size of button. This SM, when it's dealing with breakpoints, is how big the screen is, okay? So we can see this with the padding and the margin that we looked at a minute ago. There's more things we can do. I just showed you one example of this, right? You can do the same thing with margin. You can also, in fact, let's go look at the documentation so you can see the kind of weird syntax that you can do here. Let's just go spacing. If you look right here, this line right here, okay? So notice it says, let's look, ignore this one for a minute. Right here it says property, sides, breakpoint, size. Okay, property is right here, margin or padding, P or M. Okay, sides, it's T for top, B for bottom, L for left. So I could, if I wanted to, just say padding left on all these, PL, PL. Right? And so this will be weird, but it's only going to apply it to the left, right? Okay. And let's just stick with only PL5 right here. Well, we'll leave it like that, okay? The next thing though, so that's property, padding or margin, left, right, top, bottom, then the breakpoint, small, medium, large, XL, then the actual size, 0 through 5. Follow? Notice here it says to do this for small, medium, large, and XL. And then for this is for XS. Notice you just leave off the breakpoint there. The default behavior is XS, okay? If this is a little fuzzy, just read over this documentation and play around with it, right? But it has actual examples of the code here, okay? But this is how you derive in your brain what the class is called. You can also just look in the style sheet and find it somehow, right? But this is telling you how to figure out what the class is called. So think of every possible combination you can think of there. ML, then breakpoint SM and number 0. That's one class. Then there's ML, breakpoint XL, size 1, right? I mean, there's all the permutations of that, right? That's a lot of them. That's a whole bunch of different variations. All those are just classes that exist. Well, this line here that's sort of highlighted on the screen is how to help your brain create it, to help you remember it. That's really what's going on there, okay, instead of just memorizing all these classes. So a couple other things I can show you. Let's go ahead and go to where it's going to be 5. What does this mean right here? It won't increase, but yeah, so it's padding left, level 5. And level 5 is kind of spelled out for us down here, right? This is how big it is, okay? So that's going to give us just padding on the left. So let's look at it. And it's just level 5 padding, which we have. What is that going to be? Top padding of level 5, right? Well, you can actually do top, bottom, left, right, which is obviously letters that would associate with that. But you can also do X. Now that looks like the word pixel, but it's not. It's padding X, which means the horizontal padding, left and right, right? Like on an X-axis. You can do X and Y. So X does that, gives you the left and right. Y gives you top and bottom. Okay, right here. PY. Yes, same as with margin as well. Yep, exactly right. Okay, and that's all documented right here, and it tells you. And so remember, property, sides, breakpoint, size, right? Here's the property, there's the sides, and then there's the size, and then the breakpoints are elsewhere on the breakpoint page, right? Lots of stuff here, right? It's a whole bunch of stuff to think about and let it sink in, okay? I'm going to show you one last thing, and then we'll kind of talk briefly about what's going to happen next time we meet, okay? So we can, if we want, we've done this before where we hide something, right? We have a class that's called hide or something like that, and it's just display none or whatever. Well, Bootstrap has those built in for us, right? And they all start with D, D-none, right? It's like display none, okay? Refresh it, and it just goes away, right? I could say D block. Anything block. Anything that you know, display colon none, block, inline block, flex, all that, there's a D dash version of it, okay? So we're back to block here. And for example, let's make a couple of these. Display block, they get their own line, right? But if they were display inline block, they're all on the same line. Well, you can do some tricks with this. So let's go back to one button here. Actually, let's get some big old honking text here. H1 class is display one. That's that big font. We'll do Metallica again. Okay, so we have this big old humongous font here. Well, what I can do is say D-none, which is implied D-XS none, meaning display none for small, extra small screens and above, right? But, so if I refresh it right now, extra small and above, that's everything. But once I get medium, display medium, then I want to go to block. That's a class, DMD block. Okay, but I'm remembering it because of the little syntax tricks that they teach you in the documentation. Well, D is for display, MD is the screen size, and then block. So anything that's medium and above, I want to display it, right? So if I refresh, it'll come back because this is medium or bigger. It's extra large. But if I shrink it, it goes away because extra small and above up till medium is display none. Follow? So a lot of these classes have this little extra variation where you can put in a screen size or responsiveness. And if you go to the documentation and you look up responsive, if you search for that keyword right here, you'll be able to find information about that. And if you look at the grid, which we're going to talk about next time, you'll see this in play a lot. Okay, so it's all over the place. So my hope here is this. What you first of all get, big message number one. Bootstrap is just a style sheet. The end. Okay, it's also just a JavaScript file that we'll look at another day. Okay, but it's just somebody else's JavaScript, right? But for now, Bootstrap's just a style sheet. Just use the classes that are in the style sheet and poof, you magically have style from somebody that's better at designing stuff than I am, right? And probably better than most of us, right? Some of you have a better eye than others. Definitely better than I do. I'm probably the worst in the room. So I like Bootstrap for that. Okay, but that's message number one. It's just a style sheet. Message number two, there is a cubic buttload of classes that you can use, right? You just have to learn them all. Well, Bootstrap was smart enough to make the class names sort of intuitive, where you can sort of think about the pattern and figure out, oh, there's probably a class name called this, and you can kind of figure it out, right? Those are the two main things I want you to get. And the third thing is how to sort of use the documentation. We've kind of glossed over that a little bit, but hopefully you feel okay about that. Good? Okay, next time we meet, we're going to look at how to do forms, how you can use some of their classes to make your form look really cool, and how you can do nav bars, where just a couple little classes here and there, and poof, you got a magic little hamburger menu and all this stuff, which we built in class together one day, but Bootstrap did it for us. And then last, we'll look at the grid, which is this magic responsive flex thing, right? This was around before Flexbox. This is what made Bootstrap so popular, because there was no real good flexible web stuff until Bootstrap made this really cool grid system, right? Which is just a bunch of classes. Well, Flexbox came along, and for a while, Bootstrap kind of became a little bit obsolete. And then Bootstrap started improving and changing things, and they incorporated Flexbox, and they have become relevant again, especially with version 5 that's coming out next year, okay? So if you want to get a jump start on this, head over to the documentation, take a look at under the components, look at forms right here under components. Also look down at navs and nav bars right here. And then the other thing under layout, look at the grid. The grid is massive, okay? There's a lot of documentation here on this. Okay, look at all this stuff. We're going to look at some of this next time we meet, okay? Okay, any questions about anything we've looked at today?